Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. My name is Daniel Entwistle, class of 2000, and I am delighted to be here at this historic Paris Stock Exchange and to see so many fellow alums here today. What a magical place for Columbia Business School alumni and their extended families to come and discuss the relevant business, economic, and societal challenges that we face today. It was quite an honor to be asked to introduce this session entitled, How to Provide High-Quality Healthcare at an Affordable Cost. At this point in time, I cannot think of a more relevant topic to discuss. It is a topic that dominates the political elections in the United States and throughout the world. Our ability to significantly change the curve of rising healthcare costs while improving patient outcomes would not only benefit society, but the society of future generations to come. Prior to Columbia, I worked as a financial analyst in the generalist group of UBS in New York City at 299 Park Avenue. I primarily worked with both the healthcare group, the corporate finance group that did a lot of financing for life sciences companies. And interestingly, we did have a road show in Paris, and I was responsible for escorting the team around, and I learned about how much better roadshow lunches were in Paris than New York City. Whereas in New York City, it's the sort of slideshow and the rubber chicken, and everything comes at once, and then sort of half hour after the lunch, everybody starts leaving. In Paris, of course, it was a very nice appetizer, salad, several glasses of wine, a very nice entree, and of course, dessert, and then cigarettes after the dessert, and then the management presentation. So it was a great experience. I also worked in the media group at UBS, and I became close to the head of the group in New York, who one day offered me a job to work with his counterpart in Paris. And at the same time, I was also applying to Columbia Business School, and I did gain acceptance to Columbia. And ultimately, I decided on pursuing my MBA in New York and not taking the job offer in Paris. For many years, I did wonder what would have happened if I had gone to work in Paris. However, given the amount of financial consolidation that occurred after my graduation, it probably would not have worked out well. And ironically, here I am with an MBA and in Paris, so I can't complain. So Columbia Business School has meant a great deal to me, both professionally and personally. At the twilight of the 20th century, I came to Columbia Business School with an open mind and a strong desire to improve myself and to make a meaningful contribution to the field of business. The late 90s was, of course, a time of strong economic growth and optimism for the future. And it was certainly quite an honor for me to be able to study among such a group of outstanding, talented fellow classmates. We were all preparing for new chapters in our lives that would bring new careers, businesses, marriages, and families. After the first semester at Columbia, I, of course, assumed, like many of my classmates who worked in investment banking or consulting, that we would just sort of return to the industry. And I was fortunate to have secured an offer to return to UBS in New York. And at the same time, I was taking courses. I stumbled into Lynn Segalin's real estate finance course. And I think it was the first or the second class, I can't remember. She brought in a guest speaker, a practitioner who had organized the acquisition of 111 8th Avenue, which for those of you who don't live in New York, that is now known as the Google building. And it was fascinating. He was a real entrepreneur. He came in without a business suit, jeans, threw his feet up on the table, talked about, the mechanics of a building and putting the power on the roof. And it's something about that discussion and the real estate classes. I began to envision myself as an entrepreneur. And I learned a lot about myself during the last few semesters at Columbia. It allowed me to really take a pause in my career and discover new opportunities. Ultimately, after graduation, I went into the shared office space industry, which was rather small compared to today. And I was the founder of a chain of co-working centers in Midtown Manhattan. And if anybody needs a well-appointed office or virtual office in New York City, this is my plug. I'd be happy to chat with you after. I believe the same feeling of optimism and faith in business and entrepreneurship that permeated Uris Hall every day I was there still exists today. And this sense of optimism and faith in business and entrepreneurship is not just limited to the confines of Uris Hall, but I believe it does permeate on a global scale, and it certainly exists here today in Paris at this historic gathering of distinguished Columbia alumni. So, and now I'm delighted to introduce Carri Chan, Associate Professor of Business, who will be moderating this session. Carri Chan teaches the core MBA class Operations Management. Her current focus is on combining empirical approaches with mathematical modeling to develop evidence-based approaches to improving patient flow through hospitals and particularly intensive care units. And now I'll turn the floor over to Professor Chan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank all of you for being here on a Saturday morning. And especially thank you to our four panelists for taking the time and all of their involvement in the school. We really appreciate you being here. What I would like to do is start by giving a brief introduction of our panelists and then kick off the discussion. It's a very ambitious goal for the session to be talking about providing high-quality care at an affordable cost, but I hope that we'll be able to slowly chip away at this goal and get a sense of what are the challenges and opportunities that lie in the future. I just want to start by kind of going alphabetically down the line and introducing our four panelists. So our first panelist is Dr. Ghassan Abou-Alfa. He is an attending physician at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York. He specializes in the treatment of gastrointestinal cancers, particularly liver and, I'm probably mispronouncing this, biliary cancers. Dr. Abou-Alfa received his medical degree from the American University of Beirut in Lebanon and completed his postdoctoral training at Yale University School of Medicine. He received his MBA from Columbia. He serves as the chair of the National Cancer Institute Task Force for hepatobiliary cancers and the chair of the AIDS Malignancy Consortium, non-AIDS defining malignancies, liver GI task force, and is president-elect of the International Society for Gastro-Oncology. Next, our second panelist is Darren Campili. He is the vice chairman of healthcare banking at Barclays in London. He previously spent time at Deutsche Bank, both in New York and London, and most recently was the global head of healthcare investment banking there. Prior to Deutsche Bank, he worked at Novartis, and prior to that, he was at Credit Suisse First Boston. He has been involved in numerous healthcare M&As and financial transactions for many different healthcare companies across the globe. He received his MBA from Columbia and his BS from Northeastern University. Our third panelist is Tom DeRosa, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Welltower, an S&P 500 company. Under his leadership, Welltower has grown into the global leader in healthcare real estate with a broad, diverse portfolio across the US, UK, and Canada. Since he assumed this role in 2014, the value of Welltower has grown over $40 billion. He has spent time at Deutsche Bank, AG, DB, Alex Brown, and Alex Brown and Sons. And he has served on many boards, and recently was named to the Board of Overseers of Columbia Business School. He is a graduate of Georgetown University and received his MBA from Columbia. And last and certainly not least, Giovanni Monti is our fourth panelist. He leads the Global Healthcare Innovation Platform at Walgreens Boot Alliance, the first global pharmacy-led healthcare and well-being enterprise. It's a consumer-connected care solutions deployed by Walgreens Boots Alliance channels, including Walgreens in the US and Boots in the UK. Prior to creating and leading the Healthcare Innovation Platform, Mr. Monti was the Director of Corporate Development and M&A at Walgreens Boots Alliance. He holds a degree in Economic and Social Science from Bocconi University in Milan and an MBA from Columbia Business School, as well as a Master of International Affairs from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. So welcome to our panelists. To get the discussion started, I was hoping that all four of you could pine in on your thoughts. As you can tell, our panel is very diverse. They touch on many different aspects of the healthcare industry, and I think this highlights how complex the healthcare industry is today. So you guys are all involved in different parts of the system, from investing to more consumer-facing and provider roles. And so I was hoping that you could discuss some of the challenges and barriers, whether they be institutional, political, regulatory, or otherwise, that you've observed and directly faced in trying to achieve this lofty goal of high-quality healthcare, but at an affordable cost. So maybe we'll start with Ghassan and go down the way.
Well, thank you so much, Carri, and thanks again, and congratulations for Columbia on this really incredible weekend here in Paris. And it's a great honor to meet the other panelists and, of course, bring in the other perspective into healthcare. And I totally agree, actually. This is a very complex question, and admittedly, I claim that I don't have the answer, but nonetheless, at least I can bring in the challenges that we're bringing day to day, or we're seeing day to day. I think at this point in time, the consumer, i.e. the patients and families, as well as the providers being physicians or the supporters in regard to the finance component of it, are really facing a much more complex problem. What we thought could be like, I have this problem, I take that pill, is extremely much more complex nowadays. And I have to say that we're trying to catch up with the system, which is rather pretty old, and at the same time trying to make it accommodate for all the complexities of the healthcare nowadays. A patient just might come these days and will look you in the face and say, okay, I have, for example, this illness, but what about the genetic makeup of that illness, or what is the potential for my family to get that illness? And patients are becoming really very, very sophisticated in regard to understanding their disease per se. So I think this is one of the big challenges, like how complex it is. The other one is, and especially this is where the banking industry did much better than healthcare, is the system is rather very disconnected. A big challenge for us is really, rather it's an operational problem, is like, how can I make sure that a patient will get their records evolving from one institution to the other, or from one physician to the other? There's no system of any kind. Really, we are repeating things or sometimes replicating things that are not necessarily needed per se. So there should be some rather more smooth way of transitioning the information per se. And the question, who's going to be the owner? And I would say probably this is a personal view, that ultimately the owner of the medical records and of the whole information is going to be the patient and not anybody else per se. I think these are at least some introductory components from the provider standpoint that I would start with.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd just make a couple of very brief comments. For me, if we're talking U.S., the biggest issue in my mind is access. And obviously there was the Affordable Care Act, but it sort of has gone a bit sideways. But the more access that you have to physicians and healthcare, the better, the healthier the population is going to be. And we have a big issue on that in the US. The second issue in my mind is complexity. And I think if you look at healthcare costs as a percentage of GDP in the US, it's 18%. I think it's the highest in the world. You know, most developed countries are in the 10 to 11% range. And 8%, I think 8 percentage points, but I've got to be careful with my stats, is related to administration. If you had 10 PhDs that focused on various elements of the healthcare system, you wouldn't have full range of experts on the US healthcare system. Because the complexity in terms of pricing, reimbursement, what's covered, who's covered, is all extraordinarily difficult. And if you drew it on a map, you wouldn't believe how complex it is. So those, in my mind, are the two primary issues. And what I would do is, and we can come back to this later, I would contrast that with, and I'm a banker, so this is sort of almost against what I should be saying for a US market, but a single payer system with lots of transparency, I think helps to reduce the cost. And I'll leave it at that.
So I have a bit of a different perspective because I think one of the ways to provide high quality health care at an affordable cost is to keep the population well. And I work every day with a population of over 300,000 frail to cognitively impaired seniors. So let's talk about them as an at-risk population. What do we do for them? We keep them in environments that monitor their nutrition and hydration, their physical movement, their cognitive social stimulation, and safety, whether that be drug safety, because think about this, most people who are 85 plus take 8 to 10 pills a day, and we monitor their physical safety. Many of you probably know that 85% of one's healthcare expenditures over a lifetime happen in the last 2 years of life. And that's when the costs go out of control. So the model that we keep them in, this wellness model, dramatically reduces healthcare costs because our population, think about them as the frequent flyers into whatever healthcare system we're talking about in the world. If you can keep them well, you can keep them out of the system. And this is going to go a long way to lowering healthcare costs. And I think our success in managing the health and wellness of the senior population can be applied to other at-risk populations. I think that's one way we can take a bite out of the escalating costs in healthcare. And I don't think it matters what model you're in. The US does this poorly. I've seen countries like China actually have progressive ways of managing this population. And we can talk more about that as we get into the discussion.
I think all of the above is very right in a way, and I see that in everything I do on a daily basis. For us, as Carri mentioned earlier, healthcare is a very different thing because we operate in very different spaces. I'm very focused on how basically the largest pharmacy network in the US and in many other countries interacting so frequently with individuals can help in healthcare, not just drugs, but in healthcare, and very focused on how we can do that, not just in the pharmacies, but in a truly omni-channel way. And I think the points on frictions and on complexity and on behavior in a way are so valid. And if I think at some of the initiatives we're working on, the point on friction is, you put it differently, but from my perspective, looking at the patient journeys or the customer journeys, depending on who you are and at which stage they are, they're so fragmented, disconnected, data doesn't flow, therefore also behaviors are not necessarily aligned, because if there's not even information, changing behaviors becomes so difficult, and it's so difficult in any case, even with full visibility, because human nature doesn't change overnight. So I think that creating some transparency and data integration, which is, as mentioned earlier, so complicated, but it is a necessary condition to overcome the friction and the barriers generated by that. Luckily, so much is happening in healthcare on data, and healthcare is maybe one of the last few industries being digitalized, that those frictions could potentially, over the next few years, be reduced. I think also a point on complexity. To me, that's also linked to the fact that, even if we had a better integration, better data flows, better patient journeys, then there are ways of improving access and reducing cost that imply interventions in some places and saving somewhere else. So there's almost a misalignment between who needs to do what and who's going to benefit, and that's a barrier that needs to be addressed and is being addressed in certain cases and in certain countries through redefining the reimbursement rates, the regulation, and I think the shift to value-based and to prevention is starting to prove or to create some good best practices, but it's a structural barrier. There are so many more things we could be doing that we're not doing just because of this asymmetry in the allocation of costs and benefits, or in certain cases, maybe in particular in Europe, with single payers, a mismatch between the investments needed and the benefits that will come after maybe 2-3 years. It depends. Not necessarily very long term, but the starting point with so many national payers is that they are so constrained financially that if it's not an in-year saving, they cannot even think about changing that way of delivering care.
Yeah.
Is there a thought you wanted to? Okay, so I think a theme that's coming, or a dual theme that's coming up is the large complexity and the large landscape that's here, but also this need to shift and change behaviors. And I was hoping that you guys could expand a little bit upon why has it been so difficult? There have been many people talking about preventative care, starting on wellness, rather than waiting for that last couple of years, that last year of life. Why aren't we moving earlier? What do we need from a business perspective, from the products to the services? How do we get it so that there's this culture shift? And I'd be interested to hear from all of your different perspectives. Darren, you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say, again, I keep going back to the U.S. just because Columbia Business School, we're in New York, right? Maybe we should be a little bit more broad. To me, the U.S., if you look at how the U.S. system was developed, the doctors that make the most money are the physicians who are in hospitals with specialties, right? And so if you look at graduates from medical school, a lot of them want to go into specialties where they can make the most money. If you had a better primary care system which integrated wellness earlier, and the various aspects of living a more healthy life, and it covered more of the population, I think that could be a first step towards having a healthier population.
One of the things I think you were hearing is there's a disconnect in many markets in the world between the payer and the provider and the consumer. They're all disconnected. In the United States, one of the integrated models is the best integrated model I can think of is called Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser started as a payer and evolved into a provider. So it is a fully integrated system. And the leader of Kaiser Permanente is someone I hold in very high regard. His name is Bernard Tyson. And And I was on a panel with Bernard earlier this year, and it was about how do we move to this value-based healthcare model, which is based on how do you produce better outcomes at a lower cost. And Bernard said something that I often quote. He said, the problem with moving to this model is we are trying to move to a value-based model, but we're trying to do it in fee-for-service built real estate. The healthcare system was about, you're sick, come to the hospital bed, and we will fix you.
Yeah.
That's not how the payers are reimbursing the healthcare system today. And that is a major challenge. In the US, we're still delivering healthcare in what many people say is a 19th century model of the acute care hospital.
Yeah.
And it's not going to work in the future. Ghassan.
So
I thought I'd pass it to a physician. I'm always a bit nervous to say that in front of a physician.
well, so actually, one of the questions that I was asked already about 10 times in the last 2 days, and people ask me all the time, why did you go to business school? And I'll tell you one thing, I did not go to really make more money. Actually, believe it or not, actually, my institution actually sent me to business school because our job is really to expand our understanding of what we're specialized in. We are a cancer hospital at Sloan Kettering, but really at the end of the day is really how can we expand our knowledge and how can we go global to make sure that we take care of people wherever they are. And the aim is not necessarily take care of people by becoming our patients, but rather enhance the science and the understanding of the cancer wherever it is. And this really kind of like opened our eyes in a much broader way. And that's really where I would say that, and we're probably going to hear a little bit later in the day on the globalization, but if anything, globalization is a two-way street. And what we heard from Joe Stiglitz and Bruce Greenwald is really kind of embedded in what we're trying to do. And I'll give you a very, very classic example. Back in 2013, in India, it's so, of course, money is limited for most of the patients to get a pap smear, which is really what's a routine endeavor that most of the Western world will do. And some doctors for the last 16 years at Tata Hospital in Mumbai, they figured out that they can do it really dependent on healthcare workers and supporters, not necessarily physicians or even more technical advanced people, by doing a acetic acid, just visual look rather than an actual pap smear. And believe it or not, they were able to summarize that in 16 years in showing that they saved the life of 22,000 people in India at that time from the screened number of people that they worked on. And worldwide, this would translate in saving about close to 100,000 people's lives. And if anything, this is really couldn't be any more simplistic than that. And I remember I was actually on the panel for the American Society of Clinical Oncology at that time, and there was debate about what to put on the plenary session. And of course, always the envision is the new drug, the greatest, the fancy, etc. And literally, this got a lot of votes to really figure out that, you know what, we can do it in a much cheaper and much easier and more efficient way. And this ended up on the plenary session in 2013 at the ASCO. And this really is a great example about how much we can do by kind of interacting globally and at the same time making sure that we hear about more efficient ways of doing medical care. I would say nobody has a perfect model, but it's a matter of learning from every model what's best part and try to group them together. So that's really where we are.
Let me pick on a couple of points just raised. The example of Kaiser Permanente, the transition from fee-for-service to value-based, and in a way the allocation of intellectual capital, resources, and care delivery. And going back to the point on data that I was mentioning earlier, I do think that it is becoming easier, marginally easier, still terribly complex, but marginally easier to create almost virtual integrations. You no longer need to have your own population, your own providers, hospitals, all the way to primary care, thanks to data and to the digitization of the journeys, which is starting now, to try to manage that cost and access in a more optimal way, allocating the interventions where it makes sense, where you can have more prevention, where you can have lower cost, etc. But sharing the incentives between the providers and the payers. And in a way, this is going all the way to really the individuals, because they should be the center even before becoming patient, as Tom was mentioning earlier. And so I think it's good that we're seeing an evolution even of the payment system, the reimbursements, and the cost of healthcare to individuals that is trying to promote that right behavior and allocation of healthcare delivery, which is, by the way, why I think healthcare now very much belongs to business schools as well, because it's very clear that it's really a redesign to try to address that question. A lot comes from the redesign of the value chain. It's a business problem in a highly regulated business, rightly so. But
Indeed, and I think actually maybe one of the things that's coming out in the anecdotes that you're providing is, and we're also amongst a very global audience. So that I think the example that Ghassan was providing in India and Tom in citing Kaiser Permanente, there are a lot of instances that are doing things well. But why have there been such limitations in disseminating it? And it seems that they're only doing it well when their back is really up against the wall. And so I think it's thinking about how do we shift to make it so that there are more opportunities and these instances are more widespread and that they come out more. So I was wondering if you guys have thoughts on how that might be possible.
I think the healthcare sector has been slow to adopt data as its mandate, is how do we collect data, use data appropriately, and share this data to try and address this problem that we're talking about this morning. I think it's happening, again, in very disconnected ways. It was shocking to me that there exists no data on wellness, on this concept of wellness, because we're never going to be able to start to impact this issue if we can't measure outcomes of living in a wellness model. So actually, my company, Welltower, with Johns Hopkins and Columbia's School of Public Health, are collecting the data that we have and measuring outcomes, because we know that someone who lives in this wellness model, as I discussed earlier, has an exponentially lower spend, even in their last 2 years of life. Exponentially lower, because we haven't talked about the aging of the population, which is happening really not just in the US, but is happening really in the developed world, is facing the fact that the next 30 years, the fastest growing age cohort is 85 plus. So think about that in relation to healthcare spend. That's a runaway train. So we need to be incentivizing better behaviors, and it's going to start with data. And so because we have the largest population that you can track and manage, because we're managing this 300,000 plus population every day, we have the right model to produce the data, to produce this outcome data. So we're hopeful that that will start to get more attention on how do we incentivize, how do we create the right incentives for people to drink a lot of this. Because if you could just take the aging population and have them drink 8 of these a day, you will exponentially reduce the incidence of urinary tract infections. And so many seniors who show up in the emergency room have a UTI. It's because they don't drink water. Simple. It's very simple. The big question is, how do we incentivize this population to drink a lot of these, and not in a plastic bottle?
Darren.
And I think Tom had an excellent point on Kaiser Permanente, which is that they're both the payer and the provider. And in my mind, if, I'm going back to a theme that I mentioned earlier, if you own the patient, then you're going to be much more incentivized to reduce the incidence of disease. And so you're more focused on education, data, helping the person manage their own wellness, the patient manage their own wellness from an earlier point in their life, so that those last couple of years have a lot less morbidity associated with them. And I think Kaiser Permanente is a good example. I think that maybe possibly the VA is headed in that direction, right? As a, one government organization in the US that's sort of doing everything and taking control of it. I'm not saying that they're perfect, but I think those are two very interesting examples. They have to own the patient, and they have to want to believe that they're going to, in the end, by educating and being on top of the patients, that they're going to reduce the cost for the patient, but make more money for themselves, right? Because I think it's okay if it's a for-profit situation. I just think that, if they own the patient, they're more incentivized from the grassroots up.
Sure.
So we're in Paris. I'll say something in French because it really makes a lot of sense. So those of you who know one of the ads of Christophe in the old days used to say, "On peut vivre sans, mais c'est mieux avec," which is we can live without, but it's better with. And this is exactly what healthcare is, because nobody wants to be sick, but at the same time, we're trying to see if we can really do prevention. And prevention is really, in the mindset of patients, is really almost inexistent. Believe it or not, today in October, this is the actually Breast Cancer Awareness Month and Liver Cancer Awareness Month. And maybe breast because of the great advocacy that you hear about, we probably are a little bit more aware of. But for example, for liver cancer, which is something I specialize in, it's incredible how much really the preventive work that can be done in regard to avoiding people from getting into the cancer situation is almost mindset inexistent. People fall off very quickly from the preventive mode because it's not really on the mindset. And this is really something that I totally agree with Tom, is actually we need to quite a bit of work on in that regard to be able to really get people in the mindset of understanding that medicine is not a necessity, it's actually a need or almost like a luxury that's important to have the prevention first per se. The other point is, which is very important. Again, I go back to the global component. We are very keen on the globalization of the healthcare because, again, it's very important to really recognize that the problems are not necessarily the same all over, and it's very important to really acknowledge or learn how do they evolve in different parts of the world, and really to create the prevention accordingly. There's a lot of this you think global, but you have to act local thing in regard to healthcare per se. And thirdly, I agree totally with Giovanni, is in regard to the data, this is really, it's a disaster. I'll give you an example, and this is really where I had a patient one day coming, literally they could not fly from the middle of the country in the Midwest to New York because they could not fit all the bags that they had on the plane, wouldn't take them, so they decided to drive. They came literally with 4 suitcases of medical records. I'm not kidding. We didn't ask for it. They just came and felt like we need to do that. I can assure you, I can read for you the temperature of this patient every 2 minutes without any problem. But can I tell you what the patient has? No idea. It's incredible how much really would just matter of just printing and putting paperwork, not necessarily with that in intent per se. This really has to evolve very quickly to really be able to come with a certain instrument, say, this is my medical record, period, rather than really just succumbing the system with so much records that are not necessarily of necessity.
Yeah, just on that point, I think it's so easy to immediately think at how to have healthcare really predictive, personalized, etc. But in reality, on so many areas, there's still not an identified best practice because of that data scarcity. And hopefully now with this acceleration on the of healthcare becoming data rich and being digitalized, it will be easier to identify and share best practices. In a way, while healthcare is still very much local, certain components are becoming more global because of the easier possibility of sharing data. By the way, we see this also in the providers or healthcare companies becoming more global, not just in the pharma chain, but in so many other aspects, devices, tech, data, etc. So anyway, data leading to better identification of best practices on one side, and on the other one, also easier deployment across different geographies of certain solutions, because there's a certain, machine learning driven algorithms on whatever skin cancers are fine-tuned in a country. It's so much easier to deploy them globally. So that will, on one side, potentially increase access, on the other one, create a whole lot of different ethical issues and reimbursement issues. But that's another separate topic.
So what I wanted to do was open it up to questions from the audience. There's microphones going around, so if you maybe here in the front.
Thank you very much for that informative talk. I wanted just to get a perspective on the use of technology. For example, Eric Topol talks about the creative destruction of medicine. I get down to Silicon Valley quite a bit, and I know, Kaiser with their Garfield Innovation Center, which is premier, testing every new technology under the sun and then incorporating into their systems to get quality care. The use of AI in terms of patient outcomes, as well as gaming by employers to actually encourage employees to exercise and work out and provide better health. So these are all things that are entering the system and bypassing some of the traditional roots of medicine because of this payer issue. So could you talk a little bit about that and how that's really going to change the face of medicine?
Let me start off. I'd say that it's very early days. Again, I think healthcare is the last big industry to get the attention of the big technology companies. One of the companies that we have a close relationship with is Apple. And there's a lot that exists on the Apple technology platform that can enhance prevention. And what we're hoping will also lower costs of care for different at-risk populations, because that is one of the keys that we didn't talk much about, is labor, and how the costs of labor in healthcare are contributing to this, again, runaway train. So it's quite early days. But I expect you're going to see a lot of attention from Silicon Valley on this space.
I totally agree. If anything, I would say that the nice thing is that Silicon Valley is really very interested, and at the same time, they're bringing a lot of innovative thoughts in that regard. One of the things that we are currently doing is actually working very closely with Google, and we came with an idea because, as we know, ultimately in medicine, we like to collect information, what we call registries, so we can really figure out whom we're dealing with. But registries are really rather a very static format, because you give a certain questionnaire to a patient, and they fill it in the waiting area, and that's it. Do you have pain? It's going to be now, but what happened before and what happened after is not really registered on the questionnaire that we provide. And actually, we're working with Google on what we call a dynamic registry. We came with the idea, they were so open to it, and actually where we kind of, will invite patients wherever they are all over the world to really enter at any time they feel like entering a certain fact. And we're doing it very specifically for a disease that really affect only young girls all over the world. There's only 200 of them, but really there's no understanding at all why people get that. And for example, if we figure out that all of them on Sunday, they go to a specific type of pool and they swim, we can put it together. So definitely it's going that direction. I totally agree with Thomas, is that we're getting there, but not there yet. So,
Just one comment, and of course we're very active in working with pretty much all the technology companies on different potential solutions or already delivered. It's always fascinating to work with tech companies in real healthcare, because one of the things that has to give up is the concept of minimum viable product, because with human beings and lives in the middle, minimum often is not enough. Then it's doable, of course, but healthcare sometimes is a bit slower than other sectors for good reasons, because it's so coupling those different cultures of trying for 15 years and building tons of health economics and outcome evidence with the Silicon Valley MVP attitude is a good exercise.
Yeah. The only thing I was going to add to that is that I think that there's both the diagnosis and focus on the patient's technology, which I think in China they're actually trying to, not have people go to the hospital. They do it online. You visit a doctor on a screen and you tell them what your symptoms are, and then they can bypass you to a specialist because they don't have the same primary care infrastructure in China, and they're trying to improve the health of the people. And so that's one aspect of it, tied with medical records, which if you had them, right, you can actually do some of this stuff remotely. The problem is the way the reimbursement works in some countries is for the procedure. And so how do you make sure that you're actually getting paid for that? If you own the patient, then maybe it makes sense. Then you can go all the way to the other side, and we talk about machine learning. Well, machine learning I think is already starting to work, and in my mind, the big place would be radiology, right? Where we should be able to have MRIs, X-rays, et cetera, that a machine can go through and already, with lots of data, predict, is there a problem? And so I think that the spectrum of how technology can change healthcare is massive. It's the patient, the diagnosis, and it's the how quickly and efficiently can we figure out if there's a problem in a more complex situation.
In the middle here? Yes.
Is there any reliable study between warming and the presumable increase, of the healthcare costs?
The first part of the
Global warming?
Oh, global warming.
I guess I don't know if anyone is aware. To the best of my knowledge, there's nothing that demonstrates causally that global warming has caused increase in healthcare, but we see that there's certainly a correlation. Showing whether or not it caused it is a very challenging problem. So I am not aware that there's existence of that.
But to be ever so slightly optimistic, over the last 100 years, I think that life expectancy across the world has gone up, right? And it's gone up because despite all the issues that we have in healthcare, there's been massive advancements in healthcare. And so maybe offset a little bit by global warming, but a very good example would be hepatitis C. Right? 10 years ago, if you got hepatitis C, it was a long death sentence because eventually you lose your liver. Maybe you got a liver transplant, and lo and behold, there was innovation, and there were products that were developed that actually cured hepatitis C. Right? And the cost to the system of hepatitis C over 20 years as your liver goes down was massive. So the advancement in technology, the research that's happening, in the end, life expectancies have gone up, right? Maybe not quite as quickly if we didn't have global warming, but they've gone up for sure.
There's a question here in the front.
Yes, how to provide high-quality healthcare at an affordable cost. Sweden used to provide very good healthcare at an affordable cost. Lowest part of the GDP went to healthcare, let's say 10 to 20 years ago. So one question is what you say about the Swedish model, and that's no private companies, only one hand, the state decides everything. Then now we are facing a lot of private companies coming into the Swedish system now. For example, we have a digital app with a digital doctor, so you can consult it. It will be reimbursed by the state, of course, but it means that only young men between 20 and 30 are the ones who consulted this app mostly because they have a cold. it doesn't. It just adds cost to the system. So some private solutions, some digital apps are not
Yeah.
very good for the
Can I-
system.
Yeah, so I will respectfully disagree. Capio would be one of the big hospital companies in Sweden. And in my mind, yes, Swedish Healthcare is good. Yes, they have allowed private healthcare in the country or the region, in the Nordic region. If you were to ask executives that run hospital companies what they think about the Nordic hospital, for-profit Nordic hospitals, I think what they would say is they're on the leading edge of trying to figure out how to use data and how to use technology to provide a better service. And I think the very good example would be, you just had a Australian publicly traded hospital buy a Swedish publicly traded hospital this week. And the reason they did that, one of the primary reasons they did that was, are there really synergies between providing healthcare in Australia and healthcare in Sweden? It's not really, right? But it's about best practices. And I think the Australian hospital company, Ramsay, believes that they could get best practices from a technology perspective from Capio. It sounds like you don't agree with that, but to me they're very innovative, and it's happening in Finland. It's happening a little bit in Norway. For whatever reason, the for-profit, and I know in the Nordic region people don't like for-profit healthcare, but the for-profit healthcare companies in the Nordic region, in my mind, are a bit on the cutting edge on the hospital side.
And on the point of whether certain digital innovations add cost to healthcare or help reduce it, I think it's a fascinating topic, and in a way, I believe, of course, it depends on the country, on which innovation, etc. But it depends on the phase, because often I see these companies starting almost as a standalone incremental service delivery, because it's so complicated to get into the real reimbursement system or adoption by providers, etc. So they say, okay, let's build a brand, let's build a separate delivery channel, etc. And just because they need to drive adoption and do another fundraising and so on and so forth. As these technologies then actually mature a bit and become adopted by who's already managing the billions of healthcare costs, they start delivering savings because it's not an incremental network of the providers, an incremental set of companies that need their share of margins in the healthcare value chain, but become actually a way to optimize capacity to the point of scarcity of labor provision in certain areas, or reduce cost. So it's very complicated, but I think it's almost a necessary pain at the beginning to then really have an improvement as they scale up.
Yeah, and the last perspective in regard to the technology, I would say, yes, maybe you're right that the demographics of the patients and families that will take care of the will handle by technology is, as you mentioned, like in the 20s to up to 40s. But I'd say it's not necessarily 100% true, because, for example, in China, there has been a clear understanding that it depends on certain demographics. For example, some of the apps are more keen towards the younger, where there's more sophisticated information needed, versus the elder who are not necessarily up to speed in regard to the understand technology. I would say that finally it's going to be exactly as Giovanni is saying. It's going to be fine-tuned based on which specific demographics that you're dealing with. But I wouldn't really be dismissive of really the ability of technology still to penetrate with them. Yeah, sure.
The more healthcare we offer to people, the more they will want.
Sure, absolutely.
I think there's one in the back with the microphone.
I have a question about service-based delivery, specifically tech-enabled services. And I'm just curious about where you see the best applications, either now or in the near future, around telemedicine delivery and also gene therapy or gene mapping for preventative care.
Well, I can speak to telemedicine. So again, we're big believers in telemedicine, and now in our business, we're starting to incorporate the infrastructure for telemedicine in the 900 communities that we own. And we're working together with local health systems or regional health systems to, again, we know we can address many issues that would have had a senior make a trip to the emergency room. A lot of this can be handled through the appropriate telemedicine infrastructure, or a lot of wellness care that, regular visits that one would have with a physician because of one of their chronic conditions. That can be handled through telemedicine. But again, it's still very early days. The technology's all there. Is it being used broadly? I would say no. But I think you'll start to see a big ramp up in telemedicine.
Yeah, I would remain very optimistic on that. Actually, just across the street, we are on one side of the street, Sloan Kettering, and across is New York Presbyterian with Cornell, and of course Columbia across town. And believe it or not, there is a lot of use of telemedicine already, where patients are able to get access to their healthcare providers and be able to interact. And we're not necessarily only doing it in regard to the domestic, but for example, now at Sloan Kettering, if a patient in the middle of nowhere needs to really get a consult and just get a sense of about their care, they can be on a video link with their physicians and the families, and we interact as if we're in the room, and we're saving a lot of travel time as well as cost, and providing those kind of cares. But I think it's going to enhance further, as exactly as Tom is saying. So
yeah, we're very focused on that as well. So we've just launched before the summer in the US for now a platform. It's more than telemedicine. It's really to a point of reducing frictions, a platform to navigate healthcare needs called FineCare now, given that the Walgreens app is downloaded more than 50 million times. We thought, well, let's use it to make it easy for people to access their care needs. Then in some cases, it can be telemedicine. And for instance, NYP, New York Presbyterian, by the way, is on the platform as well. In other cases, maybe it's an appointment with a doctor in a clinic, whatever it is, because in reality, yes, the investors, the companies, etc., see telemedicine one side, doctors another one, etc., but the individual accessing or trying to solve a healthcare need should have an integrated solution, and then ideally over time with the data flowing. So we see that it's becoming, well, in a simple word, say, useful.
I think we have time for...
Was there a second part of that question, though, on gene therapy?
On gene therapy.
Yeah, I mean, just to hit that very, very quickly, sorry. Look, gene therapy is different, right? Gene therapy is basically curing, in my mind, curing a disease. And so I think what's interesting about gene therapy is that that's going to be one of the key test cases for how you deliver an outcome and how you get paid for an outcome. Because it's not like, you're going to have a gene therapy product that solves a particular disease state, and you're just going to get paid for providing the drug. The pricing model, which is still being developed, is going to be, okay, we're going to get rid of the disease within 3 years, except that, we're not going to pay full price if it comes back 3 years after that. So that particular area of healthcare products is still developing, but it's very outcomes focused and being developed.
So I think we have time for one last question.
Tom, you had talked about your 300,000, I'll call them clients, but patients, tenants in your facilities and managing their wellness. And I'm thinking about corporate America. So this is in the US predominantly. Many of the large companies and now even medium-sized and smaller firms have access to private clinics. So there are wellness programs that millions of employees are operating under. Either they have an on-site clinic or they have a clinic in a geographic area, and maybe the smaller businesses around that clinic, their employees have access to it. So The idea for the company was to bring their healthcare costs down and improve the wellness of their employees. My question to the panel is that model proving to work? Are you seeing positive outcomes from that model?
So at Sloan Kettering, we have actually what's called MSK Direct, and this is actually open for a lot of the companies and their employees in especially New York area, but it could be anywhere in the country. But now we're even opening what's called MSK Global Direct, and if anything, Access, which is directly to help patients. And we have noticed that definitely it makes an impact. If we see patients right at the start of symptoms, and even before a biopsy is taken, there's a chance that we're going to improve their outcome much better than if they come later in the game after they've been fiddled with in different places. It really matters a lot, really, that we get care in the appropriate hands right early in the game, at the same time by the right people. It will make a big difference by all means.
One thing I will say is the concept of keeping the workforce healthy and allowing them to work longer as we age is very important. And I was on a panel a few years ago where we talked about what if we're really living to 125? So I suggested on this panel that, in the 1970s, when many women came into the workforce for the first time, for lots of different reasons, women came back in scale into the workforce in the 1970s. And what many employers did was they set up nursery programs, which allowed women to come to work and to make sure that their child was being cared for, which helped their overall wellness. If you think about many employers, and we're working with a few of them, who are concerned about keeping their productive workforce in place into their 70s. If you're 72 and you're still working, you may be caring for a 94-year-old parent. And I think it's in this concept, John, of employer wellness and healthcare being brought, I think it's very conceivable we will one day be bringing our elderly parents to work with us. and because the cost of elder care is not generally reimbursed, whether by payers in the United States or National Health Services. The UK used to reimburse for it, and now they reimburse for it to a very small degree. So I think this is an important next step to keep men and women in the workplace longer, because we've all been given an extra 20 years of life. Because of Ghassan, because many cancers, which were death sentences 10 years ago, are now chronic diseases that can be managed. And that's wonderful. So we're all living into our hundreds. What happens to our parents? And who's going to take care of them? So I bet there will be a response in the corporate world where they will start to take responsibility for managing part of that for its workforce. We'll see.
By the way, it would be really nice if we all had Memorial Sloan Kettering Direct as our first step in figuring out if we have an issue. Yes, that would be very nice.
Okay, great. So I wanted to just kind of wrap things up. I think through this discussion we can see, one, it's a very complex landscape, but that only means that there are a lot of opportunities going forward. Something Glenn said yesterday in his State of the School address, he said the first term in Columbia Business School is Columbia. And there are a lot of interesting things going on at the university, at the business school, at the School of Public Health, at the medical school. And there are a lot of initiatives at the business school trying to bring everybody together. So I want to encourage all of you to stay involved, up to date on what's happening with the healthcare management program, and notice that there's a lot of opportunities in the future. So thank you for all of you being here, and certainly thank you to our panelists.